Good morning. Thanks for being here. I'm Katherine Klosek. I'm Director of Information Policy and Federal Relations at the Association of Research Libraries, ARL. ARL is a member association of 127 research libraries in the US and Canada. And recently, we collaborated with our colleagues in the Canadian Association of Research Libraries, CARL, on a pilot project to understand what it takes for libraries to implement the Marrakesh Treaty. You're likely familiar with the Marrakesh Treaty. It's an international instrument, and when nations sign on to ratify or accede the treaty, they then have to adopt implementing legislation in their own country's copyright law through limitations and exceptions that allow for the creation and cross-border lending of works in accessible formats. The full title of the Marrakesh Treaty is the Marrakesh Treaty to facilitate access to published works for persons who are blind, visually impaired, or otherwise print disabled. So that gives you a sense of the goal of the treaty. And through our pilot project, we looked at a number of aspects of implementation. We looked at the needs of beneficiaries or people who are blind and print disabled. We looked at metadata standards to improve discoverability, questions around authentication, and whether there are legal and policy barriers. We'll have a report coming out that gets into some of those details. But along the way, we learned about the European Union's directive to make ebooks accessible by 2025, the European Accessibility Act. And we thought that sounds like a great idea that would really make sense globally, particularly because a lot of publishers are multinational corporations, not just located in one country. I should also mention that this idea has been propagated by people like Scott Labar, who was a great advocate for people with print disabilities and unfortunately recently passed away, but was a great leader in this space. Today's session is called Making Digital Works Accessible Through Publishing, Not Permission. And that is an acknowledgement that in the US in particular, copyright law really allows libraries and other third parties or authorized entities under the Marrakesh Treaty to create and lend accessible copies. The law is really solid on this, US copyright law and case law, and the Marrakesh Treaty has been described as an even greener green light to allow for this work. But libraries are often sort of responding to one-off requests from students or faculty, to remediate works. And we think that vendors could more efficiently produce works in accessible formats, particularly works that are born digital. That's not to take away from the great work and investment and commitment that libraries have made in remediating works. But the legal onus is really, under accessibility law in the US, the onus is on institutions of higher education to provide works in accessible formats. And there really is no legal obligation for publishers. ARL recently filed comments in response to the Department of Justice Notice of Proposed Rulemaking on the Americans with Disability Act regulations. And we made these points, suggesting that born accessible publishing, which is really designing digital works with the needs of people with disabilities in mind, print disabilities, is more efficient and effective than libraries working to remediate works. And so today, we're going to talk about how libraries and vendors can work together toward a born accessible approach to scholarly works, even if the federal government in the US does not change its laws and regulations. And so we're going to turn to a discussion, and each panelist will introduce themselves as they give opening remarks. And so I wanted to start with Judy. Based on your perspective as a library director, who also has experience working in the publishing industry, what do you see as a first step that libraries and publishers can take to move toward born accessible publishing?
So I am the Dean of University Libraries at the University of Florida, and we have a small library press embedded in the university that is affiliated with the University of Florida Press. And I was a part of the Marrakesh Task Force and joined it in part because I have a great commitment already to accessibility, but I learned a great deal from it. And I think one of the first steps that we took was to model our own behavior on the behavior that we're expecting from publishers. So I realized as we were participating that we believed we were creating accessible content. And when I submitted it, because the Marrakesh Task Force was testing some commercial ebooks, and I submitted ours to them, feeling virtuous, and that we would be found to be virtuous, and discovered that we didn't have huge errors, but we had minor errors that caused us to go back to the vendor. They upgraded their software. We reprocessed several of our titles to make them fully compliant. And we now have, as part of our publishing process, the fact that our last step is to verify, in this case using the DAISY software, which the Federation for the Blind uses, before we release our publications, to verify that they are in fact accessible and not to just assume that we've done all the right steps. And I have felt then that it puts me in a better position to talk with my vendors about, are you doing this too? Or shouldn't you be doing this too? And shouldn't your license agreement commit that new content? I know there's huge issues about cleaning up and tagging retrospective content, but can't we get an affirmation that all of your new content you will certify as accessible? So that's been kind of where I think the steps are, is model the behavior you want others to follow and then try to take that message to the vendors.
Thanks, Judy. Lindsay, do you mind introducing yourself and then talking a little bit about how consortia like Neural are working to negotiate for accessible publishing clauses in license agreements for digital works? What's worked well and where can we improve?
Absolutely. So for those of you who don't know me, I am Lindsay Cronk. I recently became Dean of Libraries at Tulane University after a stint at the University of Rochester, which is where I got to be part of the most amazing group of sort of licensed negotiators and a community of practice of librarians just super committed to how do we bring forward and manifest our values in our licensed agreements with publishers and vendors. And that's to say extremely co-creatively. These were not, we started to sort of dismantle the whole notion of deal making in favor of projects and project management templates with our publisher partners. The work that I would call out as most in keeping with this, and I do want to give kudos where they're deserved to, I think, a publisher that's doing a good job on this is Sage, right? Who worked with us, who walked us through the frameworks, and it was Meredith Wilson, now at Boston College, and Eric Limpet Law, who's at Stanford, who also helped us to codify a series of criteria around this. A big part of the Neural strategy and a big part of my strategy always is to make sure the documentation is out there and make sure that the documentation is shared widely. None of us have the time to recreate or create these materials ourselves. So when I think of collective action and sort of the future forms this may take, it's a shared understanding of our responsibility for moving forward, as Judy points out. The past, maybe we're able to deal with it, and I think we've all been in those conversations. If you have any colleagues who made it through retrospective conversion, like they have the war stories to tell about this. But we need to think about moving forward, can we make it all accessible? There was that study that was published in 2022 by OSF that actually says that open publishing has some of the worst quality alt text for image files that you will see. And that's stuff that's supposed to be completely accessible from day one, right? For things to be born accessible, we need to be thinking more deeply than just the text being something that is going to go well through a screen reader, right? We have to be thinking about how are we, particularly as we hurtle towards perhaps a post-literacy world, right? If we're all following the AI context, how are we actually making sure that the data sets and files associated with these pieces are something that can be made accessible to people with any sort of image impairment? And I just want to say in closing, last year I was diagnosed with MS, and it gave me an entirely different perspective on what a visible disability is and how we address disability in libraries and in partnership with our publisher partners. It needs to be through deep and proactive design work that makes it from day one as open and accessible to as many people as possible.
That's great. Thanks, Lindsay. And then Samantha, if you don't mind introducing yourself, of course, and then describing how Berkeley Library is working to move the scholarly publishing industry toward adoption of born accessible standards.
Hi, so I'm Samantha Teremi, and I'm a licensing specialist at the University of California, Berkeley. And we are trying to place the onus on vendors and publishers to make their resources accessible when we receive them. So typically, most libraries will ask for a voluntary product accessibility template, a VPAT, in their standard licensing contracts. And then they can determine the resources level of compliance and make modifications as necessary with their Office of Disability for their users. But at Berkeley, we've been trying to go a step further because we are trying to eliminate the work of making the reasonable modifications after the fact. This helps us avoid liability on the campus's end, as well as we've established that it's the vendor's responsibility first and foremost to provide accessible materials. So in order to do this, we've changed our contractual terms. First, we're asking for an express warranty that the vendor is compliant with California state and federal accessibility laws, as well as the Web Content and Access Guidelines at 2.0 or 2.1 AA, as well as a representation that the vendor will make reasonable efforts to solve any accessibility complaints that do arise. And then we go down to our warranty disclaimer section of the contract. You'll typically find language here that the vendor disclaims all liabilities and provides the licensed materials as is. So we've started adding language that prohibits the vendor from disclaiming the accessibility warranty that they've just provided us by adding the phrase, except with respect to express warranties, you can disclaim all other liabilities. Since we've just asked them for an express warranty, we want to make sure that our statement isn't in vain. Similarly, we then go down to the indemnification section, and the contract will usually say something like, the vendor shall not be held liable for any damages. We then amend that to say, except with respect to any express warranties, the vendor will not be held liable for any damages. This ensures that if there is an accessibility issue and that they do breach the warranty, that we are receiving indemnification. It also helps the university with potential PR issues that would arise from an accessibility lawsuit. We can point to our efforts to work with vendors that have specifically promised to provide accessible materials when we entered the agreement. So we've been doing this for about a year now and have found that the vast majority of vendors and publishers have been very accepting of this new contract language, and there's been very little negotiation involved. Occasionally, smaller vendors won't accept certain parts of the warranty, particularly with regard to California state law if they're not in California, but we work with them to figure out their specific concerns so we can keep as much of our accessibility language as possible and find a statement that is agreeable for both parties. So it's been really encouraging to see vendors and publishers be so willing to cooperate with us and provide born accessible materials.
That's such great work. Thanks, Samantha. So when we chatted previously, you all made great points about the investment that libraries make in licensing resources, and then the need to go back and to test and remediate and invest resources on top of that. So I'll ask each of you to kind of comment or expand on that. But I did want to share, I pulled from ARL statistics that the average US academic library total materials expenditure is almost $15 million. And of that, about 75% is spent on ongoing resources. So that's licensed materials, and most of those are digital. So love to hear your comments on that.
So I'll kick this off because I think about it a lot. There was an article, and I was trying to find it a few years ago, that just talked about how in libraries we spend the vast majority of our budgets on resources that we want to spend the least amount of time with, right? All of our curation, all of our beloved on-site metadata, all of that work, it focuses in on the tiniest little smidgen of where we are putting our money. And what does that tell us about how we are applying our values or not, succeeding or not? And I understand the impulse of someone who was once a very overwhelmed e-resources librarian. So if you're in the room, my condolences and my deepest thanks, because the work you do is just so important. But it is a question of us dwelling in the world and the intersection of digital content and tools for accessibility as well. I would say this is a place where the onus is very fully on libraries, even if the liability isn't there. So I'm interested to hear from folks who have those strong connections, right, between their selectors, their e-resource librarians, and the folks that are managing the technologies that make all of this accessible. How strong is your relationship with your accessibility office? I think that this is sort of the key determining factor. There were the horror stories of a few years ago, which you guys may remember, where librarians were being asked suddenly to create subtitles for everything. Do you remember this? It was such a wild time. But I think that has gone away a little bit, but it's still, anytime we're outsourcing or looking at automated tools to do this, I am fundamentally aware of the fact that we are not exercising real regard and care for disabled patrons, and that number is growing at most of our institutions as our emphasis on having a more diverse population takes hold too. If we're spending millions and millions of dollars this way, we need to tend to it on the other side.
Yeah, I agree. So we are working on an accessibility statement that we've published recently at UC Berkeley, but we currently don't do any accessibility testing, which is why we've really pushed for our accessibility and licensing. It's been important for us to kind of put our money where our mouth is, since we don't have the resources to do testing with our Office of Disability.
So I agree with what they're saying, and I think there's another piece of this that we need to be looking at. As much money as we're putting into our e-resources, I do think we have responsibility to be expecting that the vendors are fully compliant, at least with current and new content, and that we somehow work with them continuously on retrospective content, because we know it continues to get used. But I think there's another whole piece of this, which is we don't have license agreements for our open access content. And where does that, we have no ability to negotiate with that. It's whatever those publishers are choosing to make open and however they are choosing to make it open. So there's, as we continue to increase the volume of open access literature, we need to be thinking about what are the mechanisms as the audience or as part of the intermediary of delivering that content to our users. How do we fold that into these requirements? And I want to share with you two comments that have very much affected my own attitude about disabilities. Many years ago, when I was working for the National Commission on Libraries, which is now part of IMLS, we had a hearing on information services for individuals with disabilities. And the opening speaker said something that changed my perception of services for disabilities. He said, "We are all only temporarily abled." And I think if you look at what we do for individuals who have a current disability, we should really be thinking about all of us at some point are going to be in that situation or have family members who are in that situation. This isn't just those people over there who've registered with the disability office. There are many disabilities that may not even be identified or disclosed. We certainly have students and faculty members who don't want to register with the disability office. I see it particularly with our veterans. I don't know if you have experienced that, but they are very reluctant to come forth and register, yet they have needs. And so if we're focusing on the entire panoply of materials that we have as being truly open, and in Marrakesh we came up with the statement, it's not open if it's not accessible. It's open to some, but it's not really open because it's not open to all. And that's, I think, the other thing that is a very profound way of thinking about all of this open access material is should be accessible to everybody. And so that's what I would share, is that I think we have a lot of work to do, but we're making good strides. But we're not going to solve it all with licensing because there's so much content out there that isn't governed in that manner.
Those are great points and, yeah, powerful reminders of why you're all doing this great work. And you mentioned we have more work to do. You've all given really specific and great examples of what you're doing in your institutions and consortia. I wonder if you can comment on how to scale it up. I know that, I'm particularly interested as, representing an association, but I know that many of you are part of, yeah, consortia. I know there's the Big Ten Academic Alliance, Library Accessibility Alliance, different groups and organizations that are focusing on this, and then publisher partnerships as well. So just love your thoughts or reflections or ideas or examples of scalability.
So we've shared what we're doing at Berkeley with ARL in a couple conversations, but we'd also like to share it with our consortium colleagues, so the California Digital Library and all the UC colleges. If we can negotiate these huge transformative agreements and e-resource licensing agreements with our massive consortium, which are costing millions of dollars. Ideally, we can make this more standard, and our hope is to really shift the publishing industry so that this becomes a norm, and that's a normal thing that libraries ask for.
At Neural, we always made a point of, again, sharing out our criteria and the way that we're going into negotiations, being as open as possible about the progress and process of that. And it's a practice that I think is really powerful. In conversations with ICOLC, it's interesting to sort of broach the issue of shared standards around this stuff, because I think we're all always trying to nail down the best deal to prove that the deal has progressed to the next thing. It's not a coincidence, right, that working in the academy, this reminds me so much of science literature, right, and the scholarly dialogue. It's not just that you do the thing, it's that you have to build on the thing. But the tracking of consistent progress when we have different priorities in competing institutions is its own challenge, I would say, its own barrier to collaboration. However, when I think about open and the vast potential for it to be born accessible, I think that the conversations that need to happen are between libraries and with publishers, with editors, right? Like we need to equip the journals themselves to have standards, and ideally those could be shared, right, through a body like NISO, particularly when we're talking about stuff like, again, how tables, like this is the thing that haunts me, having had this experience, how tables are translated into accessibility. Like how do we do that, and how do we get there when this is the shorthand for information, right? If we're thinking about the future of data as potentially the final form of scholarship, accessibility, there's a lot of catching up and thinking to do, and I'm really interested in sort of engaging in those conversations, both in the like high-level philosophical meta and in the pragmatic, like how are we doing this today?
So I think a couple of things, one of which is through several of our consortia, we have developed kind of best practice language that we recommend and try to use in all of our licenses as they come up. And we're doing that with the state university system, or we're doing it with ACER, or we're doing it with other organizations that we participate. And I think that's very important that we share that language and we try to influence one another. And if somebody's got a better set of language, I'm happy to pull it in and use that. But the other thing is we're often negotiating multi-year agreements. So we've got a couple large ones going right now. When they're done, we've got 3 years on one and 5 years on another, where whatever the best languages we get, we're living with that. But if we've got better language that we extract from them and we can pass it on to our colleagues who are negotiating the next year and the next year, we can continue to improve that language so that hopefully whatever the language says, their behavior has been modified by the language that others bring in the next year. So it is, I think, a very important thing that we do share back and forth when we get what we think is a really good clause, that we give the vendor credit for that, for doing what we think is the right thing, but we also share that as a best practice so that the next person in the queue who's coming up for their renewal can pull that language in as well.
Can I jump in? Judy, I so agree. And one thing I have been thinking of a lot is, again, you see published authors out there, and I highlighted Sage and Adam Matthew earlier. Like they're doing a really great job with visual information, figuring out how that description works and translates. There's all kinds of other aspects of accessibility that we haven't really like tread into, like epistemic justice, making sure things are like the translated version is actually workable. That requires more human labor than we want it to. But something I've been thinking about a lot is I really encourage our publisher partners to be courageous in this area moving forward. Let's put the line in the sand strongly from here so that the standards just improve over time. And if we can have sort of a shared understanding about this is what born accessible means, like if we can come together around that as a community, I only see upside for everyone involved. Every person I've spoken to, all of my colleagues in publishing, they want to see this too. So there's the will, I think, on every side to get it done.
Thank you. We did want to invite folks, we want to leave a little time for questions, so invite you to queue up if you do have a question. And in the meantime, I'd love to hear from each of you, sort of if you can share like a win or a story or something that you're particularly proud of in this space.
I think for me, it's what we started with was how we actually changed our own practice and how we recognized that with all the good intentions in the world, we were not, by not testing, we weren't confirming that we were actually doing what we needed to do. And the fact that our vendor, because we use a vendor to convert to our EPUB formats, they then improved their software because we helped them identify things that were not just affecting us, but anyone else who was using their software. And so to me, the fact that we learned a lesson that's changed our practice, but that we also, through our partnership with the vendor, improved what they were doing for everyone else. So to me, that's something I take great pride in.
So the Berkeley Library has been taking over all of our business contracts from our business school. And those negotiations have been particularly difficult. A lot of the business vendors don't necessarily work with academic libraries, and so they're not as used to our standard terminology. So we've had to undergo several intense negotiations, often on Zoom. And we're very proud of the fact that we've gotten fair use language, as modifying resources is technically a fair use under Section 108 of the US Copyright Act, and we've explicitly gotten that, as well as express warranties. And those have been just very challenging negotiations as opposed to, your standard publishers like Elsevier. So yeah.
That's such an interesting observation. So I would say my favorite thing that we've gotten done at Neural, and it's, so we built out the preferred deal elements. For those of you keeping score on those preferred deal elements, included a commitment to equity and a commitment to a diversity. And then we proceeded into a deeper period where we fleshed out what we thought this might look like in license agreements, in deals. And since then, we've also expanded, and I want to call out Meredith and Eric's work, because they have formed a task force to work with publishers to just see, how are we going to get this done together, right? Like, how are we going to make sure that we are, again, living these values in the resources that we are bringing to people and making available to them. So I would say that's my favorite thing.
Thank you. And it looks like we have a few questions. Would you mind introducing yourselves, and then let's hear it.
Hello, I'm Abby Shield, and I'm also at UC Berkeley. So, yay, Samantha.
I don't know if that's...
Oh, is it not? Sorry. Sorry. So there we go. Abby Shield, I'm at UC Berkeley as well. And one of the things in my work that I encounter a lot is I hear, and this might be kind of a mean question to ask because you're right at the start of things, but looking ahead, how do you see this maybe broadening out beyond US-based publishers or even European-based publishers, to especially as publishers in areas of the world that have been traditionally very print-focused still are starting to transition to digital formats. Have you had any thoughts about incorporating this into the conversation with them?
So we have, at least in terms of licensing, secured our new terms with a couple international vendors, particularly in Europe. A lot of them don't want to agree to standard US statute, though. So we do have to do a lot of research to figure out their equivalent of fair use, such as like fair dealing in the UK. or we usually just use WCAG guidelines, since those are pretty universal as opposed to like our federal statute. But it does involve a lot of work to determine what's applicable in terms of accessibility.
I'll say it's interesting because we're chasing Europe on so many things, and then accessibility isn't necessarily it, like in the same way as some other, like it's just, I would say, as an observation, and partially it is when we're talking so much about print shops, you know, like if it's not digital, the tools don't even begin to work. You know, there's not a Braille edition. Usually, like you're just, it reminds me so much of, you know, that off-sided thing that, is it less than 20% of all knowledge is digital at all, right? So it's another place where I think that it's challenging, but it's also heartening to think that if we put the line in the sand together, the rest of it can move forward. But I love the question.
Should I try that? It's terrific to see libraries using their purchasing power to drive born accessible publishing. So thank you all for your leadership in this space. My name is Alicia Wise, and I'm from the Clocks Archive. But I was going to make one suggestion and ask you guys one question. The first suggestion is that, as well as using purchasing power, it might be helpful to encourage publishers with carrots. And in that respect, WIPO each year has the Accessible Books Consortium International Excellence Award in Born Accessible Publishing. And anything ARL and Carl could do to raise awareness in the publishing community about that you would value seeing them win that award. Sage has done it on one occasion. I think could be really powerful. So that's the suggestion. And the question, are there any publishing trade associations that you're finding useful and helpful allies in this conversation?
So I really like the idea of identifying the awards and trying to acknowledge the publishers who are leading the way and who are doing the right thing. I'm having conversations now with several large publishers about the language I discussed in terms of, I believe you're already doing this. Can't you state it in your license? Can't you take credit for it? And can't you then let us acknowledge you and that you're deserving of that credit? And I think that is an important part of it. That if the publishers are doing the right thing, then we ought to be praising them for it, and we ought to be holding them up as a standard for other people who may not yet be there. So I love the idea of the award as one possible way, but I think in addition, it's certainly my expectation. You know, I mentioned if we get good clauses, we're going to share them with others, but we're going to share them with praise. We're going to share them with saying, look at this great commitment from this publisher or that publisher.
I think there's something to be said, too, for adapting university policy. If we have a university policy that says we can't work with vendors who do not have accessible materials, and that becomes a standard as well, then they're out of luck. And you know, we put our money where our mouth is with our purchasing power. And so I think just sometimes communicating to vendors that it's not a university policy, but that we have guidelines around this and that it is really important for us when we consider which journals to purchase does help them understand our needs and what we put importance on.
Yeah, thinking about that, because as someone who for years dwelt in a liaison services department, like there is also that other side challenge of respecting disciplinary difference, right, in all of this. And so I do, like, and we've seen this sort of tectonic shift to a small number of publishers dominating the conversation. So if we have colleagues from small publishers in the room, I'd also invite, you know, how do we help with this? Is there a different, like, you know, I love the carrots and I love the sticks. That's what I'll say. Like, and I like to apply both liberally. And so I just want to be thinking expansively about how we do that too, so that we're not continuing to move forward with the sort of hegemonic publishing landscape as possible.
Thank you. I just want to add that some of our colleagues recently participated, like on Monday, at a side event at the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, meeting on Marrakesh, sharing sort of findings and observations, and the Accessible Books Consortium was part of that. So just to say, love that suggestion, and it sounds like we have a lot to follow up on. So thank you. Please, with your question.
Any advice for institutions where we may want to do this work and draw that line in the sand, but the priorities of our parent institution don't align very well with that line?
That's always tricky. I know we've had conversations on my campus about the rising costs and the amount we're investing, particularly with some of the major publishers, and yet the value that's placed on them in terms of supporting research that would make it very difficult to take the kind of stand that you took of saying, I'm sorry, you're not 100% accessible, or you're not even accessible from this day forward. We can't deal with you. I don't know that I would have the power to do that, because I don't think I would have the backing. Better to have what we have for the people who can get it, and we're sorry if it's not helping the people with disabilities, but so I think that's where the work with the vendors really has to be, and as Alicia said, the carrots, right? We have to find reasons for them to want to do it, and to be sure that their own just standard practices, right? I mean, we added a final step in our publishing practice to test. That had been an absent step. I don't know how many of the small, large, or medium publishers have a step like that. And I don't know how hard it would be for them to add that to their process, but that certainly would be what I would want them to do.
We've had great advocates in our Office of Disability as well, in terms of making our research and our numbers known to leadership. So I would recommend that.
Or Mike. I know. Hello.